Number, they used my card for a luxury trip. I used my power to end it all. They say when you're dying, your life flashes before your eyes. But when I woke up in that hospital bed, what flashed before my eyes wasn't my life. It was the lie I'd been living. The machines around me beeped steadily, marking time I almost didn't have, counting heartbeats that belonged to someone who had just discovered she was already dead inside. My legs hung in metal scaffolding, pins and screws holding together bones that had shattered like my illusions. 3 days, the nurse had told me. 3 days I'd been unconscious. 3 days my family had known their daughter, their sister, their provider might never wake up again. 3 days they'd had to sit vigil, to pray, to show me that I mattered to them as more than a bank account with a beating heart. I reached for my phone with fingers that shook from more than just the medications. The screen was full of notifications, and for one beautiful, naive moment, I thought they would be messages of love, of worry, of desperate hope that I would be okay. I thought I would find evidence that someone, somewhere, had been holding their breath waiting for me to breathe again. The first message was from my mother. The timestamp showed it was sent while I was still unconscious, while doctors were fighting to save my legs, while my life hung in a balance that could have tipped either way. Having the most amazing time in Florence. The weather is perfect, and Connor found this incredible rooftop restaurant. You should see the sunset from here. Miss you, honey. We'll bring you back something special. The photo showed my mother and brother raising wine glasses against a backdrop of rolling Tuscan hills, their faces glowing with happiness and expensive wine. They were toasting something, celebrating, living their best life while I was learning to live it all. The timestamp on the photo was from yesterday. Yesterday, when I was still unconscious. Yesterday, when they didn't know if I would ever open my eyes again. But it was the bank alert that followed that killed whatever was left of my heart. $15,732, charged to my personal credit card. The card I'd given my mother for emergencies only. The card that now showed a transaction history that read like a luxury travel brochure. First-class flights, 5-star hotels, Michelin-starred restaurants, designer shopping sprees. They had turned my near-death experience into their dream vacation. The emotional impact hit me harder than the truck that had destroyed my legs. I didn't die when 18 wheels of steel crushed my bones into fragments. I died right there in that sterile hospital room, staring at proof that the people who were supposed to love me most had used my unconscious body as an opportunity to live like royalty on my dime. I was 28 years old, and I had just learned that to my own family, I was nothing more than a walking, talking, money-dispensing machine. And when I stopped walking, when I stopped talking, when I almost stopped breathing, they had simply helped themselves to what they wanted anyway. The nurse found me sobbing 20 minutes later, my shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it made my physical injuries seem like paper cuts. She thought I was crying from the pain in my legs. I let her believe that. It was easier than explaining that my family had used my near-death experience as their golden ticket to Europe, that while I was fighting for my life, they were fighting over which wine to order with dinner. The nurse found me crying 20 minutes later, and I told her they were tears of pain from my legs. It was easier than explaining that my family had used my near-death experience as an opportunity for a luxury vacation. It was easier than admitting that the people who were supposed to love me most had been shopping for Italian leather goods while I was learning to breathe without a ventilator. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of understanding, finally, what I really meant to them. Growing up as the eldest daughter in our family meant carrying responsibilities that weren't mine to bear. My parents worked multiple jobs, but never seemed to have enough money. And when I showed academic promise, they saw an opportunity. I was 7 when I started tutoring other kids for pocket change. I was 12 when I got my first real job, walking dogs for neighbors after school. By 16, I was working at a grocery store on weekends and maintaining a 4.0 GPA because failure wasn't an option. My mother used to cry when she talked about money, real tears that stained her cheeks and made her voice shake. She would hold my report cards with trembling hands and tell me I was their hope, their chance at a better life. She would say that God had given me my intelligence for a reason, and that reason was to lift our family out of poverty. The pressure was immense, but I wore it like armor, convinced that if I just worked hard enough, earned enough, gave enough, I could fix everything. Connor, my younger brother, was the golden child despite never lifting a finger to help. He was charming and funny, the kind of person who could make everyone laugh even when he was disappointing them. While I was studying until midnight, he was out with friends. While I was working part-time jobs, he was sleeping in until noon. While I was earning scholarships, he was barely passing high school. But somehow, he was the one who got the praise, the attention, the unconditional love. The pattern established itself early and never changed. I would achieve something remarkable, a scholarship or an award or a job promotion, and my parents would celebrate for exactly as long as it took them to ask when I could help with the next bill. My college graduation was a perfect example. I had earned my computer science degree summa cum laude, landed a job at a Fortune 500 company, and was ready to start my adult life. But instead of celebrating my accomplishments, my parents spent the dinner talking about Connor's latest scheme to become a social media influencer and how much money he needed for equipment. I spent my 21st birthday, alone in my apartment, eating instant ramen and wondering why I felt so hollow inside. I had everything I had worked for, everything I had dreamed of, but it felt meaningless because the people who mattered most to me saw me as a resource rather than a person. I was their success story, their proof that hard work pays off, their golden ticket to financial stability. But I was never just their daughter. The years blurred together after that, a constant cycle of earning, giving, and sacrificing. I sent home $2,000 every month, money that should have gone toward my own future, my own dreams, my own life. I lived in a studio apartment while my parents renovated their kitchen. I drove a 10-year-old car while Connor got a new truck for his birthday. I ate at home every night while they went out to expensive restaurants and posted pictures of their meals online. Every time I tried to set boundaries, every time I suggested that maybe I needed to save money for myself, the emotional manipulation would begin. My mother would cry about how ungrateful I was, how I had forgotten where I came from, how I was abandoning my family when they needed me most. My father would give me the silent treatment, his disappointment hanging over every conversation like a storm cloud. Connor would call me selfish, pointing out that I had so much more than they did, that I owed them for all the sacrifices they had made for me. But what sacrifices had they made? What had they given up that they hadn't forced me to give up first? I was the one who had worked through high school, who had taken on debt for college, who had built a career from nothing. I was the one who had sacrificed relationships, friendships, and personal happiness to keep them afloat. I was the one who had never taken a vacation, never bought anything nice for myself, never lived the life I had worked so hard to build. The breaking point came 6 months before the accident. I had been thinking about buying a house, something small but mine, a place where I could build a life that belonged to me. I had been saving for years, putting away every penny I could spare, and I finally had enough for a down payment. But when I mentioned it to my family, the reaction was swift and brutal. "You're being selfish," my mother said, her voice sharp with accusation. "We're struggling here, and you're thinking about buying a house? What about us? What about your responsibility to this family?" My father nodded in agreement, his face set in the disappointed expression that had haunted my childhood. Connor just laughed, a bitter sound that cut through me like a knife. "You've always thought you were better than us," he said, his eyes cold and unfamiliar. "Just because you went to college doesn't mean you can abandon your family. We raised you, we supported you, and this is how you repay us? By cutting us off?" The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to make me doubt myself, to make me feel guilty for wanting something of my own. I tried to explain that I wasn't cutting them off, that I just needed to build some financial security for myself, that I couldn't support them forever, but they wouldn't listen. In their minds, I was being ungrateful, selfish, cruel. I was forgetting where I came from, abandoning my responsibilities, betraying the people who had loved me most. The conversation ended with my mother in tears, my father silent and furious, and Connor storming out of the house. That night, I reduced my monthly contribution to $1,000. It was still a significant amount, still more than I could afford, but it was a start. I told myself that I deserved to have something of my own, that I had earned the right to build a future. I told myself that I wasn't abandoning them, just setting healthy boundaries. But the guilt ate at me anyway, a constant weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe. 3 days later, I was driving home from work when the truck ran the red light. The impact was instantaneous and devastating, the sound of metal crushing metal echoing in my ears as my car spun out of control. I remember thinking, in that split second before everything went black, that this was it. This was how my story would end. Alone, unloved, and unappreciated by the people who were supposed to care about me most. When I woke up in the hospital, the first thing I wanted to do was call my family. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the disappointment and the years of taking me for granted, I wanted them there. I wanted my mother to hold my hand and tell me everything would be okay. I wanted my father to sit by my bedside and tell me he was proud of me. I wanted Connor to make jokes, to cheer me up, to remind me that we were family, that we were in this together. Instead, I got a text message from a rooftop restaurant in Florence and a credit card bill that made my blood run cold. While I was unconscious, while doctors were fighting to save my legs, while I was lying here broken and alone, my family was living it up in Italy on my dime. They had seen my accident as an opportunity, a chance to take a vacation they couldn't afford, a chance to live the high life while I was too unconscious to stop them. The itemized charges told a story that made me sick to my stomach. First-class flights to Rome, a luxury hotel in Florence, meals at Michelin-starred restaurants, shopping sprees at designer boutiques. They had spent more in 5 days than I spent on myself in 6 months. They had used my emergency credit card to fund their dream vacation while I lay in a hospital bed, alone and forgotten. I called my bank from the hospital room, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. The customer service representative was sympathetic when I explained that I had been in an accident and someone had used my card without permission. She helped me dispute the charges and cancel the card, but the damage was already done. Not just the financial damage, but the emotional devastation of understanding, finally and completely, what I meant to my family. I wasn't their daughter. I was their ATM. I wasn't their loved one. I was their meal ticket. I wasn't their family. I was their employee, and they had just given themselves a bonus while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed. The realization was crushing, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I saw the relationship clearly, without the fog of guilt and obligation that had clouded my judgment for so long. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my financial advisor and asked her to help me secure my accounts, to set up safeguards that would prevent anyone from accessing my money without my explicit permission. I changed all my passwords, updated my emergency contacts, and made sure that no one in my family would ever again be able to use my resources without my knowledge. The next morning, I called the airline and canceled their return flights. I wasn't being vindictive. I was being practical. If they could afford to go to Italy, they could afford to get home. If they could spend my money without asking, they could figure out how to solve their own problems. For the first time in my life, I was setting a boundary and sticking to it, regardless of the consequences. The silence that followed was deafening. No calls asking if I was okay. No messages checking on my recovery. No apologies for their behavior. Just radio silence, as if I had never existed, as if the person who had been funding their lifestyle for years had simply vanished. It was confirmation of everything I had suspected, but had been too afraid to acknowledge. They didn't love me. They loved what I could do for them. When I was finally released from the hospital, I didn't go home. Instead, I went to a hotel, a quiet place where I could think and plan without the weight of their expectations crushing down on me. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how I had let things get so bad, how I had allowed myself to become so small in my own life. The reckoning came 2 weeks later. They showed up at my apartment, loud and angry and demanding answers. My mother was crying, my father was shouting, and Connor was pacing like a caged animal. They wanted to know why I had canceled their flights, why I had changed my passwords, why I was being so cruel and vindictive. "You left me alone in a hospital," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You used my money to go on vacation while I was unconscious. You didn't even call to see if I was okay." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. "That's not fair," my mother said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We were going to visit you when we got back." We needed this trip, Riley. We've been so stressed, so worried about money. We thought you would understand. Her tears were real, but they didn't move me the way they used to. I had seen behind the curtain, and I knew that her emotions were just another tool of manipulation. I understand perfectly, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I understand that you see me as a bank account, not a daughter. I understand that my value to you is purely financial. I understand that you care more about your comfort than my well-being. The truth was harsh, but it was liberating to finally say it out loud. Connor stepped forward, his face red with anger. "You're being dramatic," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "So we took a trip." "So what? You make more money than all of us combined. You can afford it. Stop being so selfish." His words were like a slap in the face, but they didn't hurt the way they used to. I had finally seen him for what he was, a grown man who had never learned to take care of himself because he had never had to. "I'm not being selfish," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I'm being realistic. I'm done funding your lifestyle. I'm done being your safety net. I'm done sacrificing my future for your present." The words felt foreign in my mouth, but they also felt right. For the first time in my life, I was standing up for myself. The argument that followed was ugly and painful, filled with accusations and recriminations that cut deep. They called me ungrateful, selfish, cruel. They said I had forgotten where I came from, that I had let success go to my head, that I was abandoning my family when they needed me most. They said things that were designed to hurt, to make me feel guilty, to make me change my mind. But I didn't change my mind. I had spent too many years letting their words control me, letting their emotions dictate my actions. I had given them everything I had, and it had never been enough. It would never be enough, because they didn't see me as a person with needs and dreams and limitations. They saw me as a resource to be exploited, a source of income to be maintained. "If you do this," my father said, his voice cold and final, "you're no longer our daughter. You're choosing money over family." His words were meant to be a threat, but they sounded like a promise. If cutting me off was the price of their love, then their love wasn't worth having. "I'm not choosing money over family," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. "I'm choosing myself over people who only love me for what I can give them. I'm choosing my future over your comfort. I'm choosing to be free." The words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, a burden I had carried for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. They left that night, and I haven't seen them since. There were no more calls, no more texts, no more emotional manipulation. Just silence, blessed and terrifying and liberating. I was alone, but I was also free. For the first time in my life, I belonged to myself. The months that followed were the hardest and the best of my life. I learned to live without their constant demands, without their emotional manipulation, without their expectations. I learned to make decisions based on what I wanted, not what they needed. I learned to value myself not for what I could give to others, but for who I was as a person. I bought the house I had been dreaming of, a small but beautiful place with a garden and a view of the mountains. I furnished it with things I loved, not things that were practical or cheap. I took vacations, real vacations, where I didn't feel guilty about spending money on myself. I made friends who valued me for who I was, not what I could do for them. The physical recovery from the accident was long and difficult, but it was nothing compared to the emotional recovery from a lifetime of being used. I went to therapy, where I learned to recognize the patterns of manipulation and control that had defined my relationships. I learned to set boundaries, to say no without guilt, to prioritize my own needs. I also learned about the people who had been there for me during my darkest moments, the nurses who had stayed with me through the night, the doctors who had fought to save my legs, the physical therapists who had celebrated every small victory. They had shown me more genuine care and compassion in a few months than my own family had shown me in years. Sarah, one of the nurses, brought me chamomile tea every morning and sat with me while I drank it. She told me stories about her own family, about the struggles and joys of raising 3 kids as a single mother. She listened when I talked about my family, offering comfort without judgment, support without conditions. Dr. Martinez, my orthopedic surgeon, would stop by my room even when he wasn't on duty, just to check on my progress and offer encouragement. He brought me books to read during my recovery, mysteries and thrillers that helped me escape from my own thoughts. He never asked for anything in return, never made me feel like I owed him anything beyond my effort in recovery. Eleanor, my physical therapist, was in her 70s but had the energy of someone half her age. She pushed me harder than anyone ever had, but she also celebrated my victories with genuine joy. When I took my first steps without crutches, she cried tears of happiness. When I walked to the end of the hall and back, she brought me a small bouquet of flowers from her garden. These people, these strangers who had become my chosen family, showed me what real love looked like. It wasn't conditional on what I could give them. It wasn't dependent on my success, or my money, or my ability to solve their problems. It was simply there, constant and unwavering, a gift given freely without expectation of return. One day, about 6 months after the accident, I found a card on my hospital bed. It was from Eleanor, written in her careful handwriting. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you need them most, who stay when everyone else leaves, who love you not for what you can do for them, but for who you are. The words brought tears to my eyes, but they were tears of gratitude, not sadness. I kept that card on my bedside table, and I read it every morning as a reminder of what I had learned. Real family doesn't keep score. Real family doesn't make their love conditional on your ability to provide for them. Real family shows up, not just when it's convenient, but when it's hard. The day I was discharged from the hospital, I felt like I was being born again. I was walking out into a world where I belonged to myself, where my worth wasn't determined by my bank account or my ability to solve other people's problems. I was scared, but I was also excited. For the first time in my life, I was free to discover who I really was. I moved into my new house on a sunny Saturday morning, and I spent the first night sitting on my porch, looking out at the mountains and feeling a peace I had never known before. I wasn't checking my phone for messages from my family. I wasn't worried about their latest crisis or their next demand for money. I was just existing in my own space, in my own time, on my own terms. The silence was beautiful. The solitude was healing. The freedom was intoxicating. I had spent so many years running from myself, from my own needs and desires, that I had forgotten what it felt like to be still. I had forgotten what it felt like to be enough, just as I was. Sometimes, late at night, I would wonder if I had made the right choice. I would think about my mother's tears, my father's disappointment, Connor's anger. I would remember the good times, the moments of genuine connection, the feeling of being needed and important. But then I would remember the credit card bill, the text from Florence, the years of being taken for granted, and I would know that I had done the right thing. Love isn't supposed to hurt. Love isn't supposed to be conditional. Love isn't supposed to drain you of everything you have to give and then demand more. What I had with my family wasn't love, it was a transaction, and I had finally found the courage to stop paying. Sarah, my nurse friend, visited me at my new house a few weeks after I moved in. We sat in my garden, drinking tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. She asked me if I missed them, if I ever thought about reaching out, if I ever regretted my decision. I don't miss the drama, I said, choosing my words carefully. I don't miss the guilt, or the manipulation, or the constant demands. But I do miss the idea of them, the fantasy of having a family that loved me unconditionally. I miss what I thought we had, not what we actually had. The distinction was important, and it had taken me months to understand it. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Grief is complicated, she said. You can grieve the loss of a relationship even when you know it was toxic. You can miss people even when you know they were hurting you. It's okay to feel sad about what could have been, even when you're grateful for what is. Her words were a gift, permission to feel the complex emotions that came with cutting toxic people out of your life. I didn't have to pretend that it was easy, that it didn't hurt, that I didn't sometimes wonder about the road not taken. I could acknowledge the pain while still celebrating the freedom. As the months passed, I built a life that was entirely my own. I decorated my house with colors I loved, not colors that were practical or cheap. I filled my bookshelves with novels and poetry, not just technical manuals. I planted a garden with flowers that served no purpose other than to be beautiful. I learned to cook, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I made friends who valued me for who I was, not what I could do for them. I dated people who were interested in my thoughts and dreams, not my bank account. I pursued hobbies that brought me joy, not just skills that would make me more valuable to others. I learned to say no without guilt, to prioritize my own needs, to value my own time and energy. The person I became was someone I actually liked, someone I was proud to be. I was no longer the anxious, exhausted, hollow person who had been slowly dying under the weight of other people's expectations. I was vibrant and curious and alive, discovering parts of myself that had been buried under years of obligation and sacrifice. Sometimes, I would catch myself in the mirror and be surprised by what I saw. There was light in my eyes again, color in my cheeks, a smile that reached all the way to my soul. I looked like someone who was living, not just surviving. I looked like someone who belonged to herself. The anniversary of the accident came and went without fanfare. I didn't mark it with sadness or regret, but with gratitude. That truck that had shattered my legs had also shattered the illusion that was slowly killing me. It had forced me to confront the truth about my relationships, about my worth, about what I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. I was walking again, stronger than I had been before the accident. Not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I had learned to stand on my own, to walk my own path, to trust my own instincts. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. One evening, about a year after I had moved into my house, I was working in my garden when I heard a car pull into my driveway. My heart skipped a beat, thinking it might be my family, come to apologize or demand money or try to manipulate me into coming back. But when I looked up, I saw Eleanor, my physical therapist, getting out of her car with a casserole dish and a smile. I was in the neighborhood, she said, which we both knew was a lie. She lived on the other side of town, and my street was nowhere near anywhere she needed to be. But she had come anyway, just to check on me, just to share a meal, just to remind me that I was loved and valued and remembered. We sat on my porch, eating her famous lasagna and watching the stars come out. She told me about her grandchildren, about her volunteer work at the animal shelter, about the book club she had joined. I told her about my job, about the promotion I had received, about the trip to Europe I was planning for the fall. "You look happy," she said, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she was seeing a miracle. "You look like yourself again." Her words brought tears to my eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. I was myself again, maybe for the first time in my life. "I am happy," I said, and I meant it. "I'm finally free to be who I really am, not who other people need me to be. I'm finally living my own life, not just funding other people's dreams." The words felt like a celebration, like a declaration of independence, like a promise to myself that I would never again let anyone dim my light. That night, after Eleanor left, I sat in my living room and looked around at the life I had built. It was small and quiet and entirely mine. There were no crisis calls in the middle of the night, no guilt trips about money, no emotional manipulation disguised as love. There was just peace, blessed and hard-won and absolutely precious. I thought about the text message from Florence, about the credit card bill that had broken my heart, about the moment I had realized that I was nothing more than a wallet to the people who were supposed to love me most. It had been the worst moment of my life, but it had also been the beginning of my freedom. They had used my card to escape their own lives, to live a fantasy funded by my sacrifice. But I had used their betrayal to escape a life that was slowly killing me, to build something real and beautiful and mine. They had stolen my money, but I had reclaimed my soul. The choice had been mine to make, and I had made it. I had chosen myself over people who only loved me for what I could give them. I had chosen my future over their comfort. I had chosen to be free, and for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone's permission to be happy. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I smiled at the thought of tomorrow. It would be a day that belonged entirely to me, a day when I could make choices based on my own desires, not other people's needs. It would be a day when I could be myself, completely and unapologetically, without fear of judgment or manipulation. I had learned that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you fall down, who celebrate your victories without asking what's in it for them, who love you not for what you can do, but for who you are. I had lost the family I was born into, but I had found the family I chose, and that made all the difference. The last thing I thought about before falling asleep was Eleanor's card, the one I still kept on my bedside table. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you need them most. I had found my real family, and they had helped me find myself. That was worth more than all the money in the world. They had used my card to run away from their own lives. I had used my freedom to run toward mine. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking anyone's permission to be happy. The months turned into a year, then 2, and my new life took on a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. I woke up each morning in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by things I had chosen because they brought me joy. There was a painting on my bedroom wall that I had bought from a local artist, not because it was practical or matched my furniture, but because something about the swirling blues and greens reminded me of freedom. There were books scattered throughout the house, novels and poetry collections that I read for pleasure, not self-improvement or career advancement. I had learned to garden, something I never imagined I would enjoy. There was something deeply satisfying about planting seeds and watching them grow, about nurturing something without expecting anything in return except the simple pleasure of growth and beauty. My tomatoes were particularly successful that second summer, and I found myself giving bags of them to neighbors, to Sarah when she visited, to the elderly man who lived next door and had become an unexpected friend. Work took on a different meaning, too. I was still successful, still driven, but I no longer felt the crushing pressure to achieve at any cost. I had learned to say no to projects that didn't interest me, to take vacation days without guilt, to leave the office at a reasonable hour. My colleagues noticed the change, commenting on how much more relaxed I seemed, how much more creative my solutions had become. It turned out that when you're not carrying the weight of other people's financial problems, you have more mental energy for everything else. I started dating again, something I had avoided for years because I never felt like I had the time or emotional bandwidth for a relationship. The first few attempts were awkward, as I learned to navigate conversations about family and background without the automatic shame that had once consumed me. But slowly, I learned to tell my story without apologizing for it, to explain my choices without justifying them to people who might not understand. There was Michael, a teacher who brought me flowers from his school garden and listened with genuine interest when I talked about my work. There was Amanda, a musician who played guitar on my back porch and helped me learn to appreciate silence. There was David, a chef who taught me that cooking could be an act of love, not just necessity. None of these relationships led to marriage or long-term commitment, but each one taught me something about myself, about what I wanted and deserved from human connection. The most significant relationship that developed during this time was with myself. I started keeping a journal, something my therapist had suggested, but I had initially resisted. Writing down my thoughts and feelings felt foreign at first, but gradually, it became a way of processing the complicated emotions that came with rebuilding a life from scratch. I wrote about the loneliness that sometimes crept in during quiet evenings, about the grief I felt for the family I had imagined but never really had, about the small victories that marked my progress toward emotional independence. One entry, written on a particularly difficult night when I had seen a family laughing together at a restaurant and felt a sharp pang of loss, captured something important. I used to think that love meant sacrifice, that caring for someone meant giving up pieces of yourself until there was nothing left. I thought that if I wasn't constantly giving, constantly providing, constantly sacrificing, then I wasn't really loving anyone. But I've learned that real love, healthy love, doesn't diminish you, it enhances you. It makes you more yourself, not less. The holidays were particularly challenging those first few years. I had always spent Christmas with my family, enduring the subtle digs about my success, the not-so-subtle hints about financial help, the careful balance of trying to be generous without enabling their dependency. The first Christmas alone was difficult, but it was also peaceful. I volunteered at a local shelter, serving meals to people who had nowhere else to go, and found more genuine warmth and gratitude in that single afternoon than I had experienced in years of family gatherings. By the third Christmas, I had established new traditions. Sarah and I cooked dinner together, a feast that we shared with Eleanor and a few other friends who had become my chosen family. We exchanged thoughtful, modest gifts, told stories, played board games that went on for hours. There was laughter without tension, generosity without expectation, love without conditions. It was what I had always imagined family gatherings could be but had never experienced. The financial freedom that came with cutting off my family's access to my money was transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was able to pay off my student loans years ahead of schedule, to build an emergency fund that actually felt secure, to invest in my retirement and my future. But more than that, I was able to be generous in ways that felt good rather than obligatory. I donated to causes I cared about, helped friends through temporary difficulties, supported local businesses and artists not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There were still moments when I questioned my choices, usually triggered by something small and unexpected. A commercial showing a happy family gathered around a dinner table, a colleague talking about helping their parents with a home repair, a news story about the importance of family bonds. In those moments, I would feel a familiar stab of guilt, a whisper of doubt about whether I had been too harsh, too unforgiving, too selfish. But then I would remember the credit card bill, the text from Florence, the years of being seen as nothing more than a source of income. I would remember the relief I felt when I stopped checking my bank account obsessively, waiting for the next crisis call, the next emergency that would drain away another piece of my financial security. I would remember how it felt to wake up without immediately wondering what my family needed from me today. The therapy sessions continued for almost 3 years, a weekly appointment that became as routine as grocery shopping or going to the gym. Dr. Sarah Chen, my therapist, helped me understand the psychological patterns that had kept me trapped for so long. She explained how growing up with emotionally immature parents had conditioned me to prioritize their needs over my own, how the constant crisis management had created a trauma response that made me feel responsible for everyone else's emotions and problems. "You were parentified as a child," she explained during one particularly illuminating session. "You were forced to take on adult responsibilities and emotional burdens that should never have been yours to carry. It's not surprising that you carried those patterns into adulthood, that you continued to see yourself as responsible for your family's well-being, even when it was destroying your own." Learning this language, these clinical terms for what I had experienced, was both validating and liberating. I wasn't crazy for feeling overwhelmed by my family's demands. I wasn't selfish for wanting to keep some of my money for myself. I wasn't wrong for setting boundaries, even when those boundaries caused other people pain. I was simply a person who had been conditioned to give more than was healthy or sustainable, and I was learning to recalibrate. The breakthrough moment came during a session in my second year of therapy, when Dr. Chen asked me a question that stopped me cold. "If you met a stranger who told you the story of your relationship with your family, what advice would you give them?" The answer came immediately, without hesitation. I would tell them to run, to protect themselves, to understand that they deserved better. It was easier to see the dysfunction clearly when I imagined it happening to someone else. That exercise became a touchstone for me, a way of checking my decisions against my values, rather than my conditioning. When I felt guilty about something, I would ask myself what I would tell a friend in the same situation. The answer was almost always kinder to myself than my initial instinct. The work environment became another area where I noticed significant changes. I had always been the person who said yes to everything, who took on extra projects, who stayed late to help colleagues with their workload. I had confused being helpful with being valuable, had believed that my worth was directly tied to my productivity and usefulness to others. But as I learned to set boundaries in my personal life, I began to apply the same principles at work. I started saying no to projects that didn't align with my career goals or personal values. I stopped working weekends, unless there was a genuine emergency. I began delegating tasks that could be done by others, trusting my team members to handle responsibilities I had once insisted on managing myself. The result was counterintuitive but undeniable. My work improved, my relationships with colleagues deepened, and my career advanced more rapidly than it ever had when I was burning myself out trying to be everything to everyone. My supervisor, Maria, noticed the changes during my performance review that year. "You seem more confident," she said, leaning back in her chair and studying me with curious eyes, "more decisive. Whatever you're doing in your personal life, it's working. You're bringing a different energy to the team, and everyone's responding to it." I thought about telling her the whole story, about the accident and the credit card and the family I had lost, but instead I simply said, "I've learned to prioritize better. I've learned to focus on what really matters." It was true, even if it didn't capture the full complexity of my journey. The friendships I built during this period were different from any relationships I had ever experienced. They were based on mutual interest and genuine affection rather than obligation or utility. Sarah, my nurse friend, introduced me to her book club, a group of women who met monthly to discuss everything from classic literature to contemporary memoirs. The conversations were intellectually stimulating but also deeply personal, as we shared how the books connected to our own experiences and challenges. Eleanor remained a constant presence in my life, a surrogate grandmother figure who remembered my birthday, brought me soup when I was sick, and offered practical wisdom gleaned from 7 decades of living. She had survived the Great Depression, raised 4 children as a single mother after her husband died young, and built a successful physical therapy practice at a time when few women worked in healthcare. Her stories put my own struggles in perspective while validating the difficulty of the choices I had made. "People always talk about blood being thicker than water," she said during one of our regular porch conversations, "but they forget the full saying. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. The bonds we choose are often stronger than the ones we're born into." Her words became another touchstone, a reminder that family is not just about genetics but about commitment, care, and mutual respect. The dating relationships, while not leading to marriage, taught me valuable lessons about what I wanted and needed from romantic partnerships. I learned that I was attracted to people who had their own passions and interests, who didn't need me to solve their problems or fund their dreams. I learned that I could be loved for who I was, rather than what I could provide, that intimacy didn't have to come with financial obligations or emotional manipulation. When relationships ended, they ended cleanly, without drama or recrimination. There were no accusations of abandonment, no attempts to guilt me into staying, no demands for continued support after the romantic connection had faded. These experiences showed me what healthy endings looked like, how people could part ways with respect and kindness even when things didn't work out as planned. The 5th anniversary of the accident passed quietly, marked only by a small celebration with my chosen family. We sat on my back porch, sharing a meal I had cooked myself, talking about our plans and dreams for the future. Sarah had been promoted to head nurse in her department. Eleanor had published a memoir about her experiences as a woman in healthcare. I had been offered a senior position at a startup that promised both creative challenges and ethical alignment with my values. As we sat there watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, I reflected on how much my life had changed. 5 years ago, I had been lying in a hospital bed, broken in body and spirit, discovering that the people I loved most saw me as nothing more than a source of money. Tonight, I was surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, sitting in a home I had bought with money I had saved, planning a future that belonged entirely to me. The last entry I made in my journal that night captured something essential about the journey I had taken. I used to think that independence meant being alone, that setting boundaries meant losing love, that choosing myself meant abandoning others. But I've learned that real independence allows for deeper connections, that healthy boundaries create space for genuine love, that choosing myself gives me more to offer the people who truly matter. I'm not the same person who woke up in that hospital bed 5 years ago. I'm someone I actually like, someone I'm proud to be, someone who finally understands that she deserves to be loved without conditions or expectations. They had used my card to escape their own lives, to live a fantasy funded by my sacrifice. I had used my freedom to build something real and lasting, and mine. The choice had been mine to make, and I had made it with full knowledge of the cost. I had lost the family I was born into, but I had found myself. And for the first time in my life, that felt like more than enough.